I don't know if you've noticed, but Clip Studio Paint has a gigantic brush settings section. It's honestly super daunting if you've never used it before, and it can be pretty confusing. I wanted to make a video simplifying and explaining each feature so that you can customize your brushes more easily and efficiently. Although this is specifically targeted towards CSP, the fundamentals apply to a lot of other programs as well, so stick around. Contrary to popular belief, brushes aren't the most important part of a drawing, and they won't immediately make you an expert. But there is a reason why professionals often stick to a brush set that they believe in, and it's because your tools do impact your work. So with that out of the way, my name is Soul, and here's how to use brush settings. I'll be jumping around the brush settings a bit for clarity, but just so you're aware, to access the brush settings you need to select any brush and then hit the wrench tool to edit it. I recommend duplicating your tools before messing with them, otherwise they'll be reset when you close and reopen CSP. For each editing option in the settings, you can enable the little I button to make that function visible when you're drawing under your brush size. If you've noticed previously that different brushes have different available settings and didn't know why, this is how you access all of them. Anyways, let's start with brush size. The bare minimum that any program will give you is the ability to change the brush size in pixels. This impacts the max amount of pixels a brush can take up, but does not necessarily reflect the minimum. Some programs will allow you to change the minimum separately or disable brush sensitivity entirely. Now is a good time to talk about Clip Studio Paint's brush size dynamics. Clip Studio has graphs which you can use to edit the pressure sensitivity and apply it to things like brush size, opacity, tilt, and so on. Essentially, you can control the output of your brushes for different levels of pressure sensitivity. For example, if you go to the brush size and draw a curve that is low all throughout, it'll be easier for you to get bigger brush sizes because it requires less pen pressure for a higher output. You can also do the opposite by drawing the line high up. Adding a dynamic curve will give varying outcomes which you can play with. I like to use an exponential curve like this so that my lines are very thin unless I push hard, but the moment I do, they'll become very thick very quickly. It gives a pretty messy look, but it's one I like. To add points to the graph, just click wherever you want to place them. You can have at most 16 on your graph at once. To remove a point, you just need to drag it off of the graph entirely. You can apply the same customization to tilt if you like. You'll also see the velocity setting, which makes your pen draw smaller the faster you go. Personally, I love drawing with this setting because it makes me feel like I'm using a dip pen. The last setting here is random, which will vary your brush size with each pen tip shape. I'll explain what that is later, but it gives this sort of blotty effect. Back to the brush settings, you'll see that there's a minimum 1 pixel option which does just as it sounds, ensuring no line goes under that size. Additionally, you can opt in for it to specify your brush size based on how zoomed in you are, making it so that your brush looks proportionally to the screen the same size at any zoom. Apply as desired. Ink refers to the way that your brush interacts with other brushstrokes. You get several options here like opacity, blending mode, and color mixing. Opacity is simple. It applies to the entire brushstroke if you have pressure sensitivity off, or it can be customized with a graph like brush size. Your opacity applies on a per stroke basis, which means that if you draw two 20% opacity strokes over each other, they'll add up to 40% opacity. This differs from layer opacity, which sets the max opacity for every stroke on that layer. Blending mode refers to the blending mode that strokes overlap each other with. Most brushes will be set to normal, but some more experimental brushes may use multiply or otherwise. For this setting, you can think of each brushstroke as being done on a new layer, but you can do it all on one. Now, color mixing is what most painterly brushes rely on. These settings can be kind of confusing and it can overlap, but here's a rundown. Okay, editor's note, but I didn't feel like I properly explained it originally, so I'm going to try again. To the extent of my knowledge, running color almost runs through what's already on your canvas. It will blur slightly with what's already there, but largely it just runs over the paint. Blend and smear both feel pretty similar to me, but feel free to test it out and see if you find an explanation. I think that smear is like a slightly longer drag. I'm really stuck, guys. Feel free to suggest something. If you turn color mixing off altogether, the colors will apply flatly over one another. As for the next group of settings, amount of paint is how strongly your colors are applied. The higher the value, the more plainly your colors will draw straight over others. The lower the value, the more it will blend with the paints you already have on your canvas. Conversely, paint density refers to how opaque the paint is. You can think about this like how much water there is in your paint. Watered out colors won't be as strong as the original tone, almost like painting with a lower opacity. If you drop this down to 0, it's like you're drawing with plain water, and so your color won't show up. Color stretch impacts how much one color drags or gets blended into the one beside it as you make a stroke with another color. Again, some of these kind of overlap, but you can play around with different combinations of settings and see what feels best for you. You can really vary the effect that the brush gives, so it's best to experiment with it. The next section is Anti-aliasing refers to how your brushes interact with nearby pixels. You can choose if your brush edges are soft, diminishing in opacity the further you get away from the center of the brush, or entirely hard, keeping everything at the same opacity. If you've tried to make pixel art before and it came out blurry, this was likely your issue. You need to have anti-aliasing entirely off to make pixel art. I like to keep my anti-aliasing either off or at a low setting because I prefer the sharper look it gives, but some people prefer high anti-aliasing because it looks smoother. On a small canvas, high anti-aliasing may impact the opacity of your brushstrokes. The look of a brush is defined by two things, its shape and its texture. Brush shape refers to the actual shape that is placed in each part of your stroke. You can see the shape of your brush by clicking the canvas once with your mouse. Think of it like a stamp that is constantly getting placed while you're drawing. You can make the shape of your stamp whatever you'd like, be it a cat, heart, diamond, rectangle, ellipse, tree, or even your watermark for convenience. The default is a circle though. Texture, on the other hand, is the overlay you put over your brush. Think of it like one of those scratch cards where you scratch a black paper with a pencil to reveal the color underneath. The pencil is your brush and the rainbow underlayer can be whatever texture you choose. I could go over how to make custom brushes and textures, but that's not what this video is about and there's others that could explain it better than I could. Continuing with the other settings, the brush tip can be adjusted by angle, direction, if the rotation matters, density, hardness, as well as how it flips. That mostly only matters if the shape is important though. Spraying effect will adjust how your brush tip is spread in a stroke. Turning it on will cause brush tip shapes to scatter. Particle size is separate from brush size because it only changes how big or small the individual particles become. Particle density refers to how many particles will be spawned, and spray deviation refers to how far particles will be spread from the center of your line. Direction of particle will change the rotation. Next, the stroke section allows you to change the amount of space between each brush tip shape with gap, and whether or not the brush will keep drawing if you hold it in the same place on the canvas with continuous spraying. Correct velocity input according to the program changes how velocity is calculated. In my experience, turning it off means less consistency, and my lines often disappear entirely if I go too fast. I always just keep this on. Ribbon can only be used with non-circle brush tips and will rotate your brush and stretch it until the next particle is placed. How big that stretches depends on your gap setting. You may be noticing some of these are pretty specific, but they all have their uses, particularly for patterning brushes. Even if you aren't constantly changing each setting, it's good to understand them if you ever need to edit a brush. Getting back to texture, CSP allows you to select any of your materials and use that as the aforementioned rainbow scratch layer. You can change how big that texture shows up, the angle it's placed at, the brightness, contrast, blending mode, and density it applies on. Emphasized density will make the marks on your material more visible. Inverting the texture will flip the values on the material you selected. Lights become darks and darks become lights. If you notice that there's a second section for brush shape, that's because of CSP's dual brush feature. It allows you to stack brush tip shapes, textures, and everything we went over before. This adds even more complexity and depth to your brush strokes. Lastly are forced effects. Forced effects are what I'm choosing to refer to all the additional fun settings as for your brushes. Let's go over them. Start and ending allows you to change how various things are impacted by where they happen in your stroke. For example, you can force a specific brush size at the start and end of your lines. This can be helpful for people who don't have access to a tablet with pressure sensitivity but still want its aesthetic. But even then, you can push this very far in different directions because CSP not only lets you change the size, but also the hue, saturation, density, particle size, thickness, and pretty much anything in relation to the brush. Watercolor Edge adds a dark outline to each of your strokes, replicating the effect you get with watercolor when it dries. You can change how thick, dark, and opaque the edge is. You can also choose to blur it with the inside of your line or process the effect after you're done with your stroke to reduce lag. I usually only notice lag if I'm using a very large brush size, but your experience may differ. Erase references vector layers, which unfortunately is also an entire other video, but simplified, it allows you to change how your eraser interacts with overlapping brush strokes, which can help with cleanup and make your line art a lot faster. Correction is something you most commonly see through stabilization, which will automatically smoothen out your lines as you draw. Having it at 0 will represent your pen strokes exactly as they are. You can also adjust this by speed. If you have it on the slow setting, the stabilization will increase the slower you draw, and the fast one will increase it the faster you draw. You can play around and see what feels best to you. I keep my stabilizers pretty low in general because I prefer the faster feeling it gives me when I'm drawing. The sharp angles toggle, as it sounds, will sharpen angles you draw. Post correction is like the stabilizer, but it only applies once your line is entirely done. This can be adjusted as well with speed, the zoom of your canvas, and Bezier curve, which changes the function the lines will be drawn with, spline or quadratic Bezier. You can find the specifications for this on Clip Studio Paint's website. Anti-overflow makes it so that you can color more messily without worrying that your strokes will fall out of the line art, or whichever layer you set to be your reference layer. You can also change the tolerance and area scaling on this similar to how you can with the selection tool. Color jitter will either allow you to change the color of each brush shape or the color of each stroke, or both. You'll be able to control how much of each aspect you want changed, including the hue, saturation, and value. You can see me talk about how and why I use it in this video. And that's it. That's every brush setting in CSP. What do you think? It's pretty expansive, right? Anyways, before I end the video, I just want to announce that I'll now be releasing videos monthly instead of twice a month. I've been getting, and will continue to get, increasingly busy, and in knowing that I would have to sacrifice either quality or quantity to manage my other responsibilities, I chose to prioritize maintaining quality for my channel. Speaking of which, next month I'll be doing an interview with 2 Lackadaisy animators, and I'm really excited for you all to see it. I hope this video helped you get the hang of brush settings. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them below. As always, if you make any drawings with something related to the video, you can tag me in them. You can find me at soul_canny on Twitter. I'd love to see what you make. And with all that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in June. Goodbye.